The air is perfectly still. February 3rd, 1945. 8 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, the walls are 2.5 meters of reinforced concrete. Above, the city is being methodically erased by Soviet artillery. Down here, in a corridor 7 meters wide, the only sound is the hum of diesel generators and the slow drip of condensation from pipes that run the length of the ceiling. A man in a gray Wehrmacht uniform walks past rooms lined with steel doors. Each door has a number. Some are open. Most are not. Behind one, a map table shows a Germany that no longer exists. Behind another, filing cabinets contain evacuation plans for 1,000 people through tunnels that, according to official records, were never built. Nobody knows how many tunnels there actually are. This is the world of the Führerbunker, the most famous of Hitler's underground installations. But fame, in this case, is a kind of deception. What the world knows about the Führerbunker, the 16 rooms, the 2 levels, the final days, is a story that has been told so many times it has calcified into certainty. What historians are discovering, slowly, grudgingly, through soil radar and declassified documents and the testimony of elderly men who were there as boys, is that the story is incomplete. Beneath Berlin, beneath Bavaria, beneath the Austrian Alps and the forests of Poland and the limestone plateaus of Normandy, there is another Germany, a subterranean Reich of concrete and steel that was never fully mapped, never fully destroyed, and in many cases, never fully explained. Before we descend, show 2 things. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if you're new here, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this kind of slow, honest investigation into what we don't yet understand. The Earth holds memory differently than we do. A building can be demolished, paperwork burned, witnesses silenced by time or intent, but concrete endures. Steel endures. The negative space of a tunnel carved through bedrock endures. What emerges when you begin to map these spaces is not a simple story of military infrastructure. It is a palimpsest, layers of construction, renovation, abandonment, and rediscovery, each layer telling a different story, and none of them quite complete. The Führerbunker itself sits at the end of a long evolution of fear and preparation. Hitler's relationship with underground spaces began not with military necessity, but with anxiety. As early as 1933, when he became Chancellor, he insisted on reinforcing the basement of the Reich Chancellery. By 1936, plans were drawn for a dedicated air raid shelter beneath the new Chancellery building that Albert Speer was designing. By 1938, as war became inevitable, those plans expanded. By 1943, they had become something else entirely. The structure that most historians refer to as the Führerbunker is actually 2 separate complexes built at different times for different purposes. The upper bunker, the Führerbunker, was completed in 1944. It sits 4 meters below ground, has 10 rooms, and was intended as a temporary shelter during air raids. And the lower bunker, the Führerbunker proper, was completed in October 1944. It sits 8 meters down, has 18 rooms, and was built to be a command center that could function for months without surface access. The walls are 2.5 meters thick. The ceiling is another 2 meters of reinforced concrete covered with a 3-meter layer of earth. The whole structure is designed to withstand a direct hit from the heaviest bombs the Allies had in 1944. But when you look closely at the construction records, what remains of them, several things are puzzling. The official contract for the lower bunker was given to the Hochtief Company in June 1944. The completion date was October. 4 months to excavate 8 meters of earth in a densely built urban center, unpour thousands of cubic meters of concrete, install ventilation systems, electrical systems, water filtration, and create a structure rated to survive a 1,000-kilogram bomb. 4 months. The difficulty with this timeline is that Hochtief's own engineers, in testimony given to American investigators in 1946, said it was impossible. They said the bunker could not have been built that quickly unless significant excavation and foundation work had already been completed beforehand. Nobody knows when that prior work was done or by whom. The layout of the lower bunker is equally strange. There are 18 rooms on paper, but survivors, secretaries, adjutants, guards describe rooms that do not appear on any surviving blueprint. A storage room filled with canned food and medical supplies that could sustain 50 people for 6 months. A radio room with equipment for both military and civilian frequencies. A room lined with filing cabinets containing documents that were, according to one account, being burned day and night in the final weeks. These rooms existed. People worked in them, but they do not appear on the maps drawn by Soviet troops who captured the bunker in May 1945, nor on the East German surveys done before portions of it were demolished in 1947 and 1959, nor on the reunification-era studies done in the 1990s. The standard explanation is that the Soviets' maps were incomplete, drawn in haste by soldiers who were more interested in looting than cartography. This is reasonable. It is probably true, but it does not explain why multiple independent witnesses describe the same missing rooms, nor why ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2008 detected void spaces adjacent to the known bunker structure that were not filled with rubble. We cannot say with certainty what those void spaces are. We cannot access them. The site is beneath a parking lot now, and the German government has shown zero interest in further excavation. What we can say is that the Führerbunker, as it exists in historical memory, is a simplified version of something more complex. From Berlin, we move south, to Bavaria, to a small town called Berchtesgaden, which sits in a valley surrounded by mountains that are themselves riddled with caves and tunnels and spaces that resist easy categorization. The Berchtesgaden is famous for one thing, the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. The house itself was destroyed by RAF bombers in April 1945, then demolished further by the Bavarian government in 1952 to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. What remains is a foundation and a spectacular view of the Untersberg Massif. But beneath the Berghof and spreading out through the mountain itself, there is something else. The Berghof bunker system was not a single structure, but a network. It began with a simple air raid shelter dug into the hillside behind the house in 1943. By 1944, it had expanded into a complex of tunnels connecting the Berghof to other buildings in the compound: the SS barracks, the greenhouse, the administrative offices. By early 1945, according to American intelligence reports, the system had grown to include tunnels extending nearly a kilometer into the mountain, connecting to natural cave systems that had been enlarged and reinforced. The Americans who arrived in May 1945 found a labyrinth. The initial survey identified 30 separate chambers and 6 kilometers of tunnels. Some were crude, carved quickly by forced laborers. Others were sophisticated, with concrete walls, electric lighting, ventilation shafts drilled up through 60 meters of rock. One tunnel led to a garage where vehicles could be hidden underground. Another led to a radio station powerful enough to broadcast across Europe. A third led nowhere. It simply ended in a wall of solid rock, as if construction had stopped mid-project. The question that immediately arose was, what was this for? The official answer, the one that appears in most histories, is that it was an emergency shelter and command post, built as the war turned against Germany and the possibility of an Allied invasion of Bavaria became real. This makes sense. It fits the timeline. It explains the hurried construction and the use of forced labor from the nearby Dachau subcamp. But when you examine the specific features of the Berghof bunker system, problems emerge. First, capacity. The bunker system could house, by conservative estimate, 500 people for several months. The Berghof staff numbered around 150. Even if you include the SS garrison and the administrative personnel, you're talking about maybe 300 people. Why build for 500? Second, the radio station. The equipment found in the deepest chamber was not standard military radio. It was high-frequency broadcast equipment, the kind used for propaganda transmission. It was also brand new, installed in January 1945, at a time when the war was clearly lost and resources were desperately scarce. Why install expensive, sophisticated broadcasting equipment in a mountain bunker when the German radio network was still functioning on the surface? Third, the incomplete tunnels. There were at least 4 tunnels that ended abruptly, not in finished chambers, but in raw rock faces. The American engineers who surveyed them concluded that they had been under active construction when work stopped, likely in late April 1945. But the rock faces showed evidence of drill marks that did not match the equipment found elsewhere in the complex. The drill holes were larger, spaced in a pattern consistent with mining or quarrying, not tunnel excavation. Several things about this are puzzling. If the tunnels were simply being expanded for more shelter space, why use mining equipment? What were they mining for? Or, and this is the interpretation that some researchers find more plausible, were they not mining at all, but drilling exploratory boreholes to connect with something that was already there? The Untersberg Mountain is limestone. It is riddled with natural caves. The longest known cave system in the region, the Schellenberger Eishöhle, extends for 5.4 kilometers and reaches depths of 120 meters. It was well known in the 1930s and 40s. It had been mapped, at least partially, by German spelunkers. And it sits less than 2 kilometers from the Berghof, at roughly the same elevation as the deepest tunnels in the bunker complex. Nobody knows if the Berghof tunnels ever connected to the natural cave system. The tunnels are sealed now. The entrances were blown up by American engineers in 1947 to prevent accidental injury. Ground-penetrating radar cannot see through 60 meters of limestone. The only way to know for certain would be to excavate, and the Bavarian government has made clear that this will not happen. What we have instead is testimony, second-hand, third-hand, but persistent. An American soldier, interviewed in 1983, recalled his unit finding a chamber in the deepest section of the bunker that was not on any map. He described it as natural, not man-made, a cave with stalactites and a pool of water, and a passage leading deeper into the mountain that his commanding officer ordered sealed immediately. A German civilian, a former forced laborer, gave testimony in 1997, describing being taken into the mountain to widen a natural passage that went down forever. A French prisoner of war, interviewed in 2004, described being part of a crew that installed electrical wiring in a tunnel that, he insisted, was not part of the Berghof complex, but somewhere else in the mountain, accessed through a hidden entrance near the village of Marktschellenberg. These accounts do not align perfectly. They come from people whose memories are decades old, filtered through trauma and translation. They are not proof. But they point to the possibility that the Berghof bunker system was not an isolated project, but part of something larger, an attempt to create a fortified zone that used both artificial and natural spaces, a network that extended beyond what we can currently map. The evidence does not support a definitive conclusion, but it does support uncertainty. And uncertainty in this case is significant because it suggests that what we think we know about the Berghof, the simple story of a mountain retreat with a bomb shelter, is incomplete. Before we can understand the scale of what was built beneath the Third Reich, we need to understand the context in which it was built, not just the military situation, but the ideology that drove it. Hitler's fascination with underground spaces was not purely practical. It was psychological, mythological, deeply tied to German romantic notions of the earth as a source of power and purity. The concept of the Untersberg as a mystical mountain where Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sleeps and will awaken to restore Germany to greatness was not a fringe belief in the 1930s. It was mainstream, promoted in films, novels, propaganda. Hitler himself visited the Untersberg repeatedly, gave speeches invoking its symbolism, chose to build his retreat within sight of it. This matters because it means that the construction of underground installations was not just about defense. It was about creating physical embodiments of ideological concepts. The bunker becomes not just shelter, but sanctuary. But the tunnel becomes not just escape route, but pilgrimage path. The hidden chamber becomes not just storage, but sacred space. This interpretation helps explain some of the otherwise baffling features of Nazi bunker construction. The excessive grandeur of certain installations, the inclusion of decorative elements in spaces that were supposed to be purely functional, the choice of locations that made little military sense, but significant symbolic sense. Consider the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters in the forests of East Prussia in what is now Poland. The complex was enormous, 7.5 square kilometers of fortified buildings, bunkers, minefields, and anti-aircraft positions, all hidden among oak and birch trees. The main bunker, where Hitler worked and slept, had walls 7 meters thick. 7 meters. The entire complex was built between 1940 and 1944, using forced labor from concentration camps, at a cost that remains unknown but was certainly enormous. The official purpose of the Wolfschanze was to provide a secure command center for the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was close to the front lines but far enough back to be defensible. It allowed Hitler to personally oversee military operations while remaining safe from Soviet air attack. But the location itself is puzzling. The Wolfschanze was built in a forest near the town of Rastenburg, which had no strategic importance. It was not near a major rail junction, not near a port, not near any infrastructure that would make it a natural command center. It was simply in the woods, in a landscape that was, according to Hitler's own statements, a reminiscent of the Germanic forests he romanticized. And the construction was excessive even by the standards of Nazi bunker building. The main bunker did not need 7-meter walls to withstand Soviet bombs. No bomb in the Soviet arsenal in 1940 could penetrate 7 meters of reinforced concrete. 3 meters would have been sufficient. 5 meters would have been overkill. 7 meters was either paranoia or something else. The something else, according to some historians, was ritual. The Wolfschanze was not just a military installation. It was a statement, a physical manifestation of the idea that the Führer was protected by forces beyond mere engineering. The forest, the concealment, the excessive fortification, all of it contributed to an aura of invulnerability that was as much psychological as physical. This quality connects to a broader pattern in Nazi construction, the use of architecture as magic. The Nuremberg rally grounds, the new Reich Chancellery, the planned megastructures of Germania, all were designed not just to be functional, but to overwhelm, to create feelings of awe and submission. The bunkers, the underground installations, operated on the same principle, but in reverse. Where the surface architecture was meant to be seen, to dominate the landscape, the underground architecture was meant to be hidden, to suggest depth and mystery and inexhaustible resources. Whether this was conscious strategy or simply the natural expression of totalitarian psychology is a question that remains open. What we can say is that it had practical consequences. The resources devoted to bunker construction, concrete, steel, labor, the engineering expertise were resources not available for other military purposes. Some historians argue that if the effort spent on the Wolfschanze and similar installations had been redirected to tank production or aircraft manufacturing, the course of the war might have been different. Others argue that the psychological value of the bunkers, both for Nazi leadership and for the German population, was significant enough to justify the cost. The debate is unresolved and probably unresolvable. But it frames the question we need to ask as we look at each of these underground installations. Was this built for military necessity, for psychological effect, or for reasons we do not yet understand? The Wolfschanze was not the only bunker complex in East Prussia. It was simply the most famous. Within a 50-kilometer radius, there were at least 6 other fortified installations, each with its own network of bunkers and tunnels. Some were headquarters for other branches of the military. Some were communication centers. Some had purposes that remain unclear. The most mysterious of these is the complex known simply as Anlage Süd, Installation South. It appears in German military records as a supply depot built in 1943, located approximately 20 kilometers south of the Wolfschanze near the village of Wilkesee. The records indicate it had underground storage for fuel and ammunition with a capacity sufficient to support operations for 6 months. When Soviet forces captured the area in January 1945, they found the installation largely destroyed. The Germans had blown the entrances and, according to Soviet reports, poured concrete into the tunnel mouths to seal them permanently, standard procedure for a retreating army trying to deny resources to the enemy. But in 1958, during construction of a collective farm, Polish workers uncovered an entrance that had not been sealed. What they found inside did not match the description of a supply depot. The Polish government records from this discovery are sparse, but what exists is striking. The installation consisted of at least 12 chambers, each approximately 10 meters by 15 meters, with ceilings 3 meters high. The walls were lined with metal shelving, most of which had been stripped, but some of which still held crates. The crates contained technical manuals, blueprints, and machine parts that appeared to be for scientific equipment, spectrometers, centrifuges, but precision measuring instruments. There was also a room that had clearly been a laboratory with ventilation hoods, sinks with acid-resistant fittings, and electrical outlets configured for high amperage equipment. This was not a supply depot. This was a research facility, underground, hidden in the forest, with no obvious connection to any known scientific or military program. The Polish government sealed the site in 1959 and classified all information about it. The declassification did not happen until 1998, and even then, many documents remain restricted. What has been released raises more questions than it answers. The blueprints found in the crates were for equipment that, according to experts who have examined them, was far more sophisticated than standard German military technology of the period. So one set of blueprints appeared to be for a particle accelerator, a device for accelerating subatomic particles to high speeds. This technology did exist in the 1940s. The cyclotron had been invented in the 1930s, and both American and German scientists were experimenting with it. But the design in the blueprints was different, more compact, and included features that suggested it was designed for underground operation, with specific accommodations for vibration dampening and electromagnetic shielding. Why would you need a particle accelerator in an underground bunker in East Prussia? The official explanation, offered by German historians after reunification, is that this was part of the Uhrenverein, the Nazi nuclear weapons program. The timeline fits, the technology fits, the secrecy fits. But the problem is that the Uhrenverein's research facilities are well documented. We know where they were: the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, the laboratory at Haigerloch, the experimental reactor at Haigerloch. There is no mention in any Uhrenverein documents of a facility in East Prussia. The alternative explanation, proposed by some researchers, is that this was not part of the Uhrenverein, but something separate, something that has not been adequately documented. This sounds like speculation, and it is, but the evidence does not fit neatly into the official story. The equipment specifications are different. The location makes no sense for nuclear research. You want uranium processing near a source of heavy water, or graphite, and there were no such sources in East Prussia. You want your physicists near a university or research center, and then the nearest one was in Königsberg, which had its own facilities. What makes this puzzling is that the installation was clearly important. It was heavily fortified. It had power generation capacity far beyond what a simple supply depot would need. And it was large, ground-penetrating radar surveys done in 2003 suggest that the 12 chambers found in 1958 are not the full extent of the complex. There are additional void spaces, possibly more chambers, possibly tunnels, that have not been excavated. The picture that emerges is not tidy. We have a facility that looks like a research laboratory, equipped for sophisticated scientific work, hidden in a forest bunker, with no clear connection to known programs, and partially unexplored. We have blueprints for equipment that may or may not have been built. And we have a historical record that is incomplete, and in some places, actively suppressed. This is where the certainty runs out. We can say that Anlage Süd existed. We can say it was not a simple supply depot. We can say it was doing something scientific. What exactly and for what purpose, we cannot say with confidence. From the forests of East Prussia, we move west, to France, to the coast of Normandy, where the cliffs rise white and stark above beaches that, in June 1944, became synonymous with liberation and sacrifice. But before D-Day, before the landings, those cliffs were German territory, and the Germans did what they always did with territory. They dug into it. The Atlantic Wall is well known. 15,000 fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, built to repel an Allied invasion. Most were surface installations, bunkers with gun emplacements, observation posts, anti-tank obstacles. But in Normandy, particularly along the coast between Cherbourg and Le Havre, there were also underground installations of a different character. The most extensive of these is beneath the Pointe du Hoc, a promontory between Utah and Omaha beaches that rises 30 meters above the sea. The Germans recognized it as a strategic position and fortified it accordingly. On the surface, 6 concrete casemates for 155mm guns, with overlapping fields of fire covering both beaches. Below the surface, a network of tunnels and chambers that, according to American reports from June 1944, extended at least 200 meters inland and descended to a depth of 15 meters. And the Rangers who assaulted Pointe du Hoc on the morning of June 6th found the surface fortifications heavily damaged by naval bombardment, but intact enough to be dangerous. They fought their way to the gun positions and discovered that the guns themselves were not there. The casemates were empty. The guns had been moved inland, away from the bombardment, but within range of the beaches. What the Rangers did not have time to explore in the chaos of the assault was the tunnel system. That investigation came later, in the weeks after the beachhead was secured. And what the Americans found was both militarily significant and deeply strange. The tunnels were not crude. They were engineered with concrete walls, electric lighting, ventilation, and narrow-gauge rail tracks for moving supplies. And they connected the surface casemates to underground storage chambers, ammunition magazines, and barracks that could house up to 200 men. This much made perfect sense. What did not make sense was the depth and extent of the system. The tunnels descended in stages like a mine. The first level, at about 5 meters depth, contained the storage and living quarters. The second level, at 10 meters, contained a command center and communication equipment. The third level, at 15 meters, was different. It consisted of a single long corridor, 3 meters wide and 2.5 meters high, that ran parallel to the cliff face for approximately 180 meters. Along this corridor were 12 rooms, each about 4 meters square, with heavy steel doors. When American engineers entered these rooms in July 1944, they found them empty, not just empty of equipment, but empty of anything that would indicate what they had been used for. No furniture, no wiring, no pipe fittings, just concrete cubes with doors. The American report, written by a Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, describes them as cells and speculates that they might have been prisoner-holding areas. This is possible, but it raises the question, why would you need a prison 15 meters underground in a coastal fortification? The Germans had plenty of prisoner-of-war camps farther inland. There is no record of prisoners being held at Pointe du Hoc. The alternative interpretation, suggested by French researchers in the 1990s, is that these were storage vaults for something valuable: art, gold, documents. This also seems unlikely. Coastal fortifications were subject to bombardment. If you wanted to store something valuable, you would not choose a location that was an obvious military target. A third interpretation, less comfortable, is that these rooms were never finished, that they were part of a construction project that was interrupted by the invasion and never completed. This would explain the emptiness. But it does not explain why you would build 12 identical rooms in a location that is extremely difficult to access, requires excavation through solid rock, and serves no obvious military purpose. What we can say with confidence is that the Pointe du Hoc tunnel system was not a standard design. It does not match the Atlantic Wall bunker blueprints that were captured after the war. It does not match other coastal fortifications in Normandy. And it appears to have been a custom project designed for this specific location, and the design criteria remain unclear. The tunnels are still there. They are sealed now, too dangerous for public access due to decades of erosion and collapse. But in 2011, a group of historians and engineers from the University of Caen obtained permission to conduct a survey using ground-penetrating radar and laser mapping. What they found was that the known tunnel system is not the complete system. The radar detected void spaces, tunnels or chambers, that do not appear on any German or Allied maps. Some of these voids are adjacent to the known corridors, suggesting rooms that were never opened or were sealed after the war. Others are deeper at a level of approximately 20 meters below the lowest known section. And one void, the largest, D, appears to run perpendicular to the cliff face, heading inland for at least 50 meters before the signal becomes too degraded to interpret. The team recommended further investigation, including possible excavation. The French government declined, citing safety concerns and the site's status as a memorial. The tunnels remain sealed. The voids remain unexplored. The pattern repeats across Europe. Every major Nazi installation has these characteristics: official plans that are incomplete, construction that exceeds stated needs, spaces that were never adequately documented or explained. Some of this is simply the fog of war, records destroyed, witnesses dead, information lost. But some of it appears to be intentional obscurity, a deliberate effort to keep certain aspects of construction hidden even from the Nazi bureaucracy itself. And this becomes clearer when we look at the documentation that does exist. The Nazis were obsessive record keepers. They documented everything: troop movements, supply requisitions, labor assignments, even the most horrific aspects of the Holocaust. The paper trail is vast and, in many cases, painfully complete. But for bunker construction, the documentation is patchy. Contracts exist. Blueprints exist. But they often do not match the physical reality. A contract will specify X cubic meters of concrete for a project, but geological surveys after the war show that far more concrete was poured. A blueprint will show a bunker with 10 rooms, but witnesses describe 15. Labor records will show 500 workers assigned to a project, but the scale of the excavation suggests a workforce 2 or 3 times that size. The most systematic study of this discrepancy was conducted in the 1980s by a West German historian named Dr. Klaus Fischer. Fischer spent 15 years analyzing Nazi construction records, cross-referencing them with Allied intelligence reports, Soviet documents, and physical surveys of surviving installations. His conclusion, published in a 1992 monograph, was that approximately 30 to 40% of Nazi underground construction was never properly documented. This includes not just small discrepancies, but major projects, entire bunker complexes, kilometers of tunnels, facilities that employed thousands of workers that appear in fragmentary form or not at all in official records. Fischer's explanation for this was compartmentalization. The Nazi regime did not trust its own bureaucracy. Sensitive projects were deliberately siloed, with different contractors handling different aspects and no single entity having complete information. This is a plausible explanation. It fits what we know about Nazi administrative practices. It explains the gaps in documentation, but it does not explain why the gaps are so large or why they are concentrated in certain types of projects. Fischer noted that the discrepancies were most significant in installations that were either very early, built between 1933 and 1939, before the war, or very late, built in the last 2 years of the war, when resources were scarce and the regime was desperate. The middle period, 1939 to 1943, has much more complete documentation. This creates a chronological puzzle. Or if compartmentalization was standard practice, you would expect gaps throughout. Instead, you have 2 periods where information is systematically missing, separated by a period where it is relatively complete. This suggests that something changed, either in how projects were conceived and managed or in what they were for. One interpretation, controversial but defended by several researchers, is that the early and late periods represent different kinds of projects. The early period before the war includes installations that were ostensibly for defense but may have had other purposes: research, storage, or symbolic functions tied to Nazi ideology. The late period includes installations built under conditions of extreme secrecy, often in response to specific threats or opportunities that the regime wanted to conceal. This interpretation is speculative. It requires assuming that the Nazis had coherent long-term plans that are not evident in the documentary record. It requires assuming that resources were diverted to secret projects even when the war effort was failing. These are big assumptions, but they are not baseless. Consider the complex known as Ries, Giant, in the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia, in what is now southwestern Poland. Ries was not a single installation, but a network of 7 separate complexes, spread across 50 square kilometers, all under construction simultaneously in 1944 and 1945. The scale is staggering. The tunnels total over 50 kilometers. The excavation moved over 10 million cubic meters of rock. The labor force peaked at 13,000, most of them concentration camp prisoners from the nearby Gross-Rosen camp. The official purpose of Ries, according to captured documents, was to create bomb-proof factories for aircraft production and weapons manufacturing. This makes sense. By 1944, Allied bombing had devastated German industry, and moving production underground was a logical response. But the physical characteristics of Ries do not match this explanation. The tunnels are too irregular. Aircraft factories need large, open spaces with high ceilings and smooth floors for assembly lines. The Ries tunnels have low ceilings, varying widths, and floors that are rough and unfinished. Some sections are enormous, chambers 30 meters wide and 15 meters high, but they are not connected in any way that would support industrial production. They are just big rooms carved into mountains for no apparent reason. Moreover, the construction method was wasteful. The Germans had experience building underground factories by 1944. They knew how to do it efficiently, using existing mines or quarries. Ries was built from scratch in solid rock using methods that were slow and labor-intensive. If the goal was to get production capacity online as quickly as possible, Ries was the wrong approach. So what was it for? The honest answer is, we do not know. There are theories. Some researchers believe it was intended as a command center for the Nazi leadership, a final redoubt from which to continue the war even after Germany was occupied. Some believe it was connected to secret weapons research, possibly nuclear. Some believe it was meant as storage for looted art and gold, a treasure vault hidden in the mountains. All of these theories have problems. The command center theory does not explain the layout, which is poorly suited for military command and control. The weapons research theory is unsupported by any physical evidence. No laboratory equipment, no scientific instruments, nothing that suggests research activity. The treasure vault theory is based largely on wishful thinking and the fact that gold is occasionally found in the region, though none of it has been definitively linked to Rees. What makes this particularly frustrating is that Rees was abandoned before completion. The Soviet advance in early 1945 forced the Germans to evacuate. They blew many of the entrances, though not all, and left the complex unfinished. When Polish authorities began exploring it in the 1950s and 60s, they found a maze of incomplete tunnels, unconnected chambers, and no clear indication of final purpose. Recent investigations using ground-penetrating radar and laser scanning have added new layers of mystery. A 2015 survey detected anomalies, areas where the rock density is lower than it should be, suggesting either voids or backfilled spaces. Some of these anomalies are in locations that match the entrances that were blown up in 1945. But others are in locations where no entrance has ever been documented, deep in the mountain, inaccessible from the known tunnel network. Whether these are natural geological features, unexplored tunnels, or something else is a question that remains open. Excavation is difficult. Should the tunnels are unstable, there have been collapses. People have died. The Polish government has restricted access to most of the complex, allowing only supervised tours of a small section and scientific research on a case-by-case basis. The mystery persists. Rees is there, under the mountains. 50 kilometers of tunnels carved for a purpose we cannot definitively identify, left incomplete, partially explored, full of spaces we cannot explain. This quality, the incompleteness, the ambiguity, is not unique to Rees. It characterizes Nazi bunker construction as a whole, and it raises a fundamental question about historical method. How do you write the history of something that was deliberately obscured, incompletely documented, and in many cases, physically inaccessible? The traditional approach is to rely on what can be verified. Should you work from documents, cross-reference testimony, visit sites when possible, and construct a narrative that is conservative and evidence-based? This is good practice. It produces histories that are defensible and unlikely to be overturned by new evidence. But it has a weakness. It assumes that what was documented is representative of what existed. And in the case of Nazi underground construction, this assumption is questionable. Consider what we know about the scale of construction. The official records indicate that approximately 350 major bunker complexes were built across German-controlled territory between 1933 and 1945. Major, meaning installations that required more than 10,000 cubic meters of concrete or employed more than 500 workers. This number is derived from contracts, labor records, and post-war Allied surveys. But geological surveys, done piecemeal over the decades since the war, suggest a different number. When you account for all the underground spaces that have been discovered by accident, by construction projects, by deliberate search, the number is closer to 500. And when you add the spaces that have been detected but not fully explored, the number might be as high as 600. A discrepancy of 250 installations, each of which required enormous resources, thousands of workers, months or years of effort. How do you hide that? The answer appears to be you do not hide it completely. You obscure it, you compartmentalize, you use different contractors for different projects, you classify the records, and you destroy documentation when the war ends, and you rely on the fact that after a catastrophic defeat, nobody has the time or resources to conduct a comprehensive audit. This is, fundamentally, a story about absence, about what is not in the archive. and absence is hard to write about because it is by definition not there. You can point to it, gesture toward it, say, something should be here and is not, but you cannot describe it in detail because it does not exist in describable form. What does exist is circumstantial evidence. Labor records that show workers assigned to projects with no corresponding construction contracts. Geological anomalies that suggest excavation in areas where no excavation was documented. Testimony from elderly men and women who remember as children or young adults seeing things being built, being taken underground, being told not to speak of it. This testimony is fragile. Memory is unreliable. People misremember, conflate different events, fill gaps with imagination. But when multiple independent witnesses describe similar things, a tunnel entrance in a specific location, a bunker beneath a certain building, a facility that does not appear on maps, it becomes harder to dismiss. The challenge for historians is to navigate between credulity and skepticism, to take testimony seriously without treating it as fact, to acknowledge uncertainty without lapsing into relativism, to say, we do not know, while still trying to know. Before we move to the final section, we need to address a question that has been implicit throughout. Why does this matter? Germany lost the war. The Nazi regime was destroyed. The bunkers, or whatever they were for, did not save Hitler or prevent the Allied victory. They are historical curiosities, archaeological puzzles, but they did not change the outcome. This is true, but it misses something important. The bunkers are not just relics. They are evidence of how a regime thought, what it valued, where it put its resources. And the fact that we do not fully understand them suggests that we do not fully understand the regime. This is not an academic point. Neo-Nazism is not a dead ideology. It persists, adapts, finds new forms. And part of its persistence comes from the mythology that surrounds the Third Reich, the idea that the Nazis were uniquely powerful, uniquely advanced, possessors of secret knowledge and secret weapons that almost allowed them to win. This mythology is dangerous, and it is fed, in part, by mysteries like the ones we have been exploring. When people encounter the Ries complex, or the unexplored tunnels beneath Pointe du Hoc, or the missing rooms in the Führerbunker, they fill the gaps with speculation. And some of that speculation is benign, but some of it is not. Some of it feeds conspiracy theories about Nazi superweapons, or hidden treasure, or the survival of the regime in some underground fortress. The antidote to this is not to deny the mysteries, but to investigate them rigorously and honestly. To acknowledge what we do not know while being clear about what we do know. To demystify without oversimplifying. This is difficult work. It requires access to sites, which is often restricted. It requires resources, which are limited. And it requires patience, because the answers, if they exist, will not come quickly. The final major installation we need to consider is the least accessible and, in many ways, the most enigmatic. The complex beneath the Harz Mountains in central Germany, in the region around the town of Nordhausen. The Harz Mountains are limestone and gypsum, honeycombed with natural caves. Some of these caves have been known for centuries. Others were discovered by mining operations in the 18th and 19th centuries, and some were discovered or created by the Nazis in the 1940s. The most famous of these is the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp complex, which was built to house the underground factories where V-2 rockets were assembled. The tunnels there are extensive, 25 kilometers of passages carved into the mountain, some natural, some expanded and reinforced by forced labor. The conditions were horrific. Thousands of prisoners died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and abuse. The Mittelbau-Dora tunnels are well documented. They were liberated by American forces in April 1945, extensively photographed, and have since become a memorial site. We know what they were for. We know what happened there. But Mittelbau-Dora was not the only underground installation in the Harz region. Within a 30-kilometer radius, there were at least 10 other sites where the Germans conducted excavation or construction in natural caves. Some of these are documented, some are not. One that falls into the not category is the installation near the village of Elrich, about 15 kilometers south of Nordhausen. There is no official name for this site. It does not appear on lists of Nazi installations. It is mentioned in exactly 3 documents: a labor assignment record from October 1944, a Soviet intelligence report from May 1945, and a memo from the East German Ministry of the Interior from 1953. The labor assignment record lists 68 workers, 32 Germans, 36 foreign laborers, assigned to Project Steinbruch Elrich, which translates to Quarry Project Elrich. The work description is vague. Excavation and reinforcement. The duration is listed as ongoing. The Soviet report is more detailed but difficult to interpret. It describes a tunnel entrance concealed in a quarry, leading to a series of chambers that showed evidence of recent occupation: food waste, cigarette butts, discarded clothing. The report notes that the chambers were of unusual construction, with smooth walls suggesting machine cutting rather than manual excavation. It also notes that the deepest chamber contained metal fixtures of unknown purpose, bolted to the floor and walls. The East German memo is a response to a query about whether the Elrich site should be preserved as a memorial or sealed for safety. The memo recommends sealing, noting that the site is unstable and has no historical significance beyond its use as a minor labor project. And that is all we have. 3 documents. No blueprints, no photographs, no further investigation. But in 2008, a group of amateur historians and cavers from the region decided to locate the site and explore it. They used the Soviet report's description to identify the quarry, found an entrance that had been partially sealed with concrete, and, against regulations and at considerable risk, entered the tunnel. What they found matched the Soviet description: a tunnel approximately 2 meters wide and 2 meters high, descending at a slight angle into the mountain. After 50 meters, the tunnel opened into a chamber approximately 8 meters by 10 meters, with smooth walls that did indeed appear to have been cut by machine. The chamber had metal fixtures on the floor, bolts and anchor points, but no equipment. Beyond this chamber, the tunnel continued. The cavers followed it for another 100 meters, passing 2 more chambers, both empty. And then the tunnel ended, not in a collapse or a natural wall, but in a concrete barrier. The barrier was thick, at least 1 meter, and had been poured in place, filling the entire cross-section of the tunnel. The cavers photographed the site, uploaded their report to a caving forum, and left. The site was officially sealed by authorities in 2009, and no further exploration has been permitted. The photographs are still available online. They show exactly what the cavers described: smooth-walled chambers, metal fixtures, and a deliberate concrete barrier. What they do not show is what is beyond the barrier. Several things about this are puzzling. First, why seal the tunnel from the inside? If the Germans were abandoning the site in 1945, they would seal from the outside at the entrance. Sealing from the inside suggests either that they wanted to prevent access to something deeper in the tunnel, or that the work was done after the war by someone with a reason to hide what was there. Second, the machine-cut walls. The Nazis had tunnel boring equipment in 1944. It was used in other projects, but it was also rare and expensive, reserved for high-priority installations. Why use it on a minor quarry project in a small village? Third, the Soviet report's description of metal fixtures of unknown purpose. The cavers' photographs show anchor bolts, the kind used to secure heavy equipment. But there is no sign of what that equipment was, no scars on the walls, no debris. Everything was removed cleanly. The honest answer is that we do not know what the Elrich installation was for. We do not know if it is connected to Mittelbau-Dora or to some separate project. We do not know what is beyond the concrete barrier. And unless someone decides to excavate, which seems unlikely, we probably never will. This is the reality of researching Nazi bunkers. For every installation that is well documented and understood, there are 2 or 3 that are fragmentary, obscure, and inaccessible. And the inaccessibility is not always physical. Sometimes it is bureaucratic, the result of governments deciding that certain sites are too dangerous or too sensitive to open. Sometimes it is financial, the result of limited resources for historical research. And sometimes it is simply that nobody with authority cares enough to find out. We are near the end now, but before we close, we need to return to where we started, the Führerbunker. Because the Führerbunker, despite being the most famous of Hitler's bunkers, despite being the site of his death, despite being excavated and studied and memorialized, is still not fully understood. The basic facts are known. Hitler moved into the bunker in January 1945 and remained there, with brief absences, until his death on April 30th. He married Eva Braun on April 29th. He wrote his political testament, naming Admiral Dönitz as his successor. He said goodbye to his staff. And then he and Braun went into his private quarters, where he shot himself, and she took cyanide. Their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden, doused with gasoline, and burned. The remains were buried in a shell crater. Later, they were exhumed by Soviet troops, examined, and secretly reburied. In 1970, they were exhumed again, cremated, and the ashes scattered in the Elbe River. This is the official narrative, supported by testimony from multiple witnesses and forensic evidence. So it is almost certainly true in its broad outlines. But there are details that do not fit. Small things, odd things, the kind of things that, individually, can be dismissed, but collectively suggest that the picture is incomplete. First, the testimony of Rochus Misch, Hitler's bodyguard, who was one of the last people to see him alive. Misch gave multiple interviews before his death in 2013, and his account is largely consistent with the official narrative. But in a 2005 interview, he mentioned something that does not appear in earlier accounts. He said that on the morning of April 30th, Hitler asked him about the status of the lower exit. Misch assumed he meant the tunnel that connected the Führerbunker to the Reich Chancellery basement. But when Misch reported that the tunnel was clear, Hitler said, "Oh, not that one. The other one?" Misch said he did not know what Hitler meant, and Hitler did not explain. The conversation ended. Misch thought little of it at the time. Hitler was stressed, possibly confused, and did not mention it in his initial post-war debriefings. This is a single ambiguous statement from a man recalling events 60 years later. It proves nothing, but it is interesting. Second, the Soviet investigation. The Soviets captured the bunker on May 2nd, 1945. They conducted a thorough search, interviewed survivors, and collected physical evidence. Their investigation was extensive and professional, but it was also secretive. The Soviets did not share their findings with the Western Allies for decades. The full report was not declassified until 1993. When it was declassified, historians discovered several oddities. The Soviets had found more rooms than appear on the German blueprints. They had found evidence of recent construction, wet concrete, fresh welding marks, in sections of the bunker that, according to the blueprints, had been completed in October 1944. And they had found a tunnel entrance sealed with a steel door that led downward from the lowest level of the Führerbunker. The Soviet report describes this tunnel as blocked by debris approximately 10 meters from entrance. The Soviets did not attempt to clear it. They documented its location, noted it as probable emergency exit or ventilation shaft, and moved on. But here is the problem. There is no tunnel on the German blueprints. There is no emergency exit from the lowest level. The ventilation shafts are accounted for. and none of them are in the location the Soviets describe. So where does the tunnel go? The most straightforward explanation is that it is exactly what the Soviets thought, an emergency exit added in the final months that was never completed or was blocked during the final battle. This is plausible. The Germans were improvising constantly in the last weeks of the war. But there is no record of such construction, no contract, no labor assignment, no testimony from workers or engineers. And the location of the entrance, in a storage room that was, according to all accounts, rarely accessed, is odd. If you are building an emergency exit, you put it somewhere obvious, where people can find it in a crisis. You do not hide it in a storage room. The alternative interpretation is that the tunnel was older, a part of an earlier phase of construction, and was sealed or forgotten by the time Hitler moved in. This would explain the lack of documentation. It predates the Führerbunker proper. But it does not explain why the Soviets found evidence of recent activity. The steel door, which showed no rust, and the debris blocking the passage, which included fragments of concrete that appeared freshly broken. Third, the ground-penetrating radar surveys. In 2008, as part of the project that detected void spaces adjacent to the Führerbunker, engineers also surveyed the area directly beneath the known structure. They were looking for utility tunnels, cisterns, foundations, anything that might affect the stability of the site. What they found was an anomaly, a void space approximately 3 meters by 4 meters and at a depth of 12 meters, 4 meters below the lowest level of the Führerbunker. The void is directly beneath the location where the Soviets documented the sealed tunnel entrance. The engineer's interpretation was that this is a natural feature, a cavity in the bedrock that the bunker's foundation was built around. Berlin's geology is complex, with layers of sand, clay, and glacial till, and natural voids are not uncommon. But the shape of the void is regular, too regular for a natural cavity. And the radar signature suggests that it is not filled with soil, but is, in fact, a hollow space. The German government has not authorized excavation. The site is a memorial. The political will to disturb it, for the sake of satisfying historical curiosity, does not exist. So the void remains unexplored. And the tunnel, if it is a tunnel, remains sealed. This is the nature of the mystery. Not a single dramatic revelation, but an accumulation of small anomalies. A conversation about the other exit, a Soviet report that does not match the blueprints, a radar signature that is too regular to be natural. None of these things alone proves anything. Together they suggest that the Führerbunker, like so many other Nazi installations, is not quite what it seems. And this brings us to the question we have been circling. What do we do with mystery? How do we hold it, write about it, think about it, without either dismissing it as irrelevant or inflating it into something sensational? The answer, I think, is to treat it as what it is: a gap in knowledge, a space where evidence is insufficient, where competing interpretations are possible, where certainty has not been achieved. This is not the same as saying anything is possible or we cannot know anything. It is saying we know this much, and beyond this point, the evidence becomes thin. The Führerbunker is a building. We know its dimensions, its construction, its purpose. We have photographs, blueprints, testimony. We know Hitler died there. We know how and when, and within reasonable limits, why. But we do not know everything. We do not know if there are rooms that were never documented. We do not know where the tunnel the Soviets found leads, or if it leads anywhere. We do not know what the void space beneath the bunker is. These are not trivial questions. They are not essential to understanding the fall of the Third Reich or the end of World War II. But they are part of the historical record, or rather, they are part of the gaps in the historical record. And acknowledging those gaps is important because it keeps the past open, unfinished, subject to revision as new evidence emerges. The same is true for Riese, for the Berghof, for the Wolfschanze, for Anlage Süd, for Point du Hoc, for Elrich, for the dozens of other installations we have not explored in detail. Each of them is a space that was built for a reason, used for a purpose, and then abandoned or destroyed, leaving behind fragments that do not quite add up to a complete picture. The picture we have now, the one constructed from documents and surveys and testimony, is this. The Third Reich, in its 12 years of existence, built a shadow infrastructure, a network of underground spaces that extended across Europe, consuming vast resources and enormous labor, much of it forced. Some of these spaces were purely military, some were industrial, some were connected to ideology or symbolism, and some, perhaps many, had purposes that were never clearly defined or were deliberately obscured. This infrastructure is still there. It has not gone away. Some of it is accessible, preserved as memorials or tourist sites. Some is sealed, deemed too dangerous or too sensitive to open. And some is simply forgotten, known only to local historians or cavers or construction workers who stumble across it by accident. And beneath all of it, beneath the known and the forgotten and the sealed, there are the spaces we have detected but not explored. The voids on the radar scans, the tunnels that end in concrete barriers, the chambers described by witnesses but not found by investigators. These are the mysteries that remain. Not dramatic or sensational, not evidence of secret weapons or hidden treasure. Just absence, spaces where something should be known and is not. From the bunkers of Berlin to the tunnels of the Harz, from the cliffs of Normandy to the forests of East Prussia, we have traced a geography of uncertainty. A map with gaps, places where the lines trail off into speculation. This is not the kind of history that provides clear answers or satisfying conclusions. It is the kind of history that shows you the limits of what can be known and asks you to sit with that discomfort. Because the truth is that history is not a completed thing. It is not a story with a beginning, middle, and end that we can read from a comfortable distance. It is an ongoing negotiation between the past and the present, between evidence and interpretation, between what is documented and what is remembered and what is simply there, in the ground, waiting to be found or to remain hidden. The bunkers are there, under Europe, some known, some forgotten, some yet to be discovered. They are evidence of a regime's paranoia, its ambition, its final desperation. They are also evidence of how difficult it is to erase the past completely. Concrete endures. Steel endures. The negative space of a tunnel endures. And so, the questions endure. What were these spaces for? Who built them? And why? What did they contain? What do they contain still? We do not have complete answers. We may never have them, but the questions remain worth asking because they keep us honest about what we know and what we do not. The earth holds memory, and we are still learning how to read it. From the depths beneath the Reich Chancellery, from the limestone caves of Bavaria, from the sealed tunnels and unexplored voids and spaces that resist explanation, good night.